The story of ancient Greece does not begin with Greece. It begins with something older, stranger, and more completely lost, a civilization that rose and fell on the islands of the Aegean Sea, while the ancestors of the Greeks were still wandering the edges of the known world, before anyone had yet spoken the words that would become the Greek language. To understand what Greece became, you have to start with what came before it, with the civilizations that built extraordinary things in the same geography, and then disappeared so thoroughly that they left almost nothing behind except the ruins and the silence and the faint echo of their existence in myths that later people told about gods and monsters and a labyrinth beneath, a palace where a creature waited in the dark. The Minoans were there first. By around 3000 BC, on the large Mediterranean island of Crete, a civilization was developing that would remain, for nearly 1,000 years, the most sophisticated culture in the Aegean world. The Minoans, a name given to them by modern archaeologists, because the Minoans left no texts that anyone has yet been able to read, built their palace centers at Knossos, Phaistos, and other sites across the island in a form that still astonishes the people who study them. These were not simple fortified strongholds. They were complex, multi-story administrative and residential centers with running water carried by clay pipes, with drainage systems that collected waste and channeled it away from living spaces, with storage rooms holding thousands of large ceramic jars filled with oil and grain, with workshops for craftsmen and artists and administrators. They were, by any honest assessment, more technologically sophisticated than most of what was being built anywhere else in the world at the time. And the art that has survived the collapse of Minoan civilization suggests a people of remarkable sensibility, dolphins leaping through painted waves on palace walls, young athletes vaulting over the backs of bulls in frescoes that convey a sense of movement and joy that very few ancient cultures managed to achieve. Priestesses and goddesses rendered with a dignity and power that suggested women occupied positions of genuine significance in Minoan religious and perhaps political life. The trade networks the Minoans maintained stretched from Egypt to the Levant to mainland Greece, making Crete the hub of a Mediterranean commercial world that operated with a sophistication that would not return to that part of the world for centuries after the Minoans were gone. And then they were gone. Around 1450 BC, the great palace centers of Minoan Crete collapsed simultaneously, in circumstances that historians and archaeologists have been arguing about for over a century without arriving at a complete explanation. The volcanic eruption on the island of Thera, one of the most violent geological events in human recorded history, an explosion that would have produced tsunamis, ash, fall, and climate disruption across the region almost certainly played a role. Some palace sites show evidence of fire and violence. The sequence of catastrophe is impossible to reconstruct with certainty. What is certain is the result. The Minoan civilization vanished from history with a completeness that is itself one of the most remarkable facts about it. The Greeks, who would eventually build their own civilization on the same soil 1,500 years later, knew almost nothing about what had come before them. They had myths, Minos the king, Daedalus the craftsman, the Minotaur, in the labyrinth beneath the palace. But these were stories that had passed through so many generations and so many transformations that no historical truth could be reliably extracted from them. The Minoans left no readable texts, no surviving kings whose names could be written on a list, no founding story that any subsequent civilization preserved. They built in a silence that the collapse made permanent. What rose in the space the Minoans left was something both more familiar and more violent. The Mycenaeans were the first Greek-speaking people, mainland warriors, who built their fortress cities at Mycenae and Tiryns and Pylos, with walls so massive, so constructed from stones so enormous, that the Greeks, who later walked past them, assumed the walls had been built by giants. They were not philosophers or artists in the Minoan tradition. They were organized, militaristic, administratively sophisticated conquerors who maintained palace economies, tracking every head of livestock and every measure of grain, in a script called Linear B, that their own descendants would forget completely when the system that Tam required it collapsed. They traded. They conquered. They almost certainly fought a version of the war that Homer transformed into the Iliad, some real conflict, with the wealthy city of Troy, on the coast of Asia Minor around 1200 BC, fought for reasons that may have had more to do with trade routes and tribute than with a stolen queen. And then, in the space of a few decades around the turn of the 12th century BC, the Mycenaean world collapsed, too part of a catastrophe, so total that historians call it the Bronze Age collapse and have never fully explained it. The palace economies vanished. The administrative records stopped being kept. The trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean came apart. Populations declined sharply. Settlements shrank. And with the administrative system went the writing, Linear B, disappearing from the historical record so completely that when writing returned to Greece, it would be an entirely different script from an entirely different source. What came after the Bronze Age collapse was not Greece as history knows it. It was something older and harder, a long, slow darkness, from which the civilization that would eventually produce democracy and philosophy and theatre would need centuries to emerge. The story of how that emergence happened is not the story of a sudden awakening. It is the story of a people rebuilding from almost nothing, one generation at a time. Imagine a world where you know, from the stories your grandparents told, that something greater once existed in the same ground you are standing, on great buildings, great kings, great wars, but you cannot find the evidence of it anywhere, and you are not entirely sure whether the stories are history or dreams. That was the situation of the people who lived in Greece during the 4 centuries that followed the Bronze Age collapse. The palace cities were gone. The administrative systems that had organized thousands of people toward common purposes were gone. The writing that had recorded the names of kings and the quantities of grain was gone so completely that no one alive could remember it had ever existed. Population had dropped sharply. The best estimates suggest that Greece may have lost 1/3 to 1/2 of its people in the collapse and its immediate aftermath. The villages that remained were small, self-contained, and largely cut off from each other by the breakdown of the trade networks that had previously connected them. The Dark Ages of Greece were not merely a period of political instability or economic recession. They were the experience of civilizational forgetting, of a people living in the ruins of something they could not name, building smaller and simpler lives in the shadow of walls they assumed must have been built by a race of giants, because nothing in their current world could explain how ordinary human beings had made them. And yet the darkness was not total, and this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Greek Dark Ages. People continued. They spoke. They remembered, in the particular way that oral cultures remember, not with documents and archives, but with stories, songs, and the collective practice of telling the past to the present in forms that could be carried in a human voice across any distance and through any catastrophe. The epics that Homer would eventually give their literary form, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the 2 foundational texts of Greek civilization, and among the foundational texts of world literature, were not composed in a palace or a library. They were assembled, over generations of oral transmission, by singers who memorized thousands of lines of verse, and who carried within those lines the compressed memory of a Bronze Age world that no longer existed, but that the stories kept alive in a different form. The heroes of the Iliad lived in a world of palaces and bronze weapons, and wide-ranging sea voyages that was closer to the Mycenaean world than to the world of the Dark Age communities that preserved the stories. The poems are a form of cultural memory, imperfect and transformed by centuries of retelling, but real, the last surviving signal from a civilization that had otherwise gone entirely silent. What the Dark Ages preserved, and what they quietly built, matters more than what they lost, because what they built would eventually become the foundation of everything. The distinctly Greek practices that historians can trace to this period, the competitive athletic festivals, the shared religious sanctuaries where communities from different places came together to worship and to compete, the culture of hospitality that created obligations between strangers and bound communities across the distances that separated them. These were the social technologies that allowed the Greek world to function as something more than a collection of isolated villages, even in the absence of the same administrative systems that the Bronze Age had used for the same purpose. The sanctuary at Delphi, where Greeks from across the Mediterranean world would eventually come to consult the oracle and deposit the treasures of their cities, has its origins in this period. The Olympic Games, held every 4 years beginning in 776 BC by the traditional dating, brought together Greeks from communities that might otherwise never interact into a shared ritual of competition that defined, and repeatedly redefined, who counted as Greek. These institutions were not planned. They grew from the specific circumstances of a people who had lost the large-scale coordination of the palace world and needed new forms of connection to replace it. The return of writing around 800 BC was the moment when the slow recovery of the Dark Ages became something that history could record rather than merely infer. But the writing that returned was not a revival of what had been lost. Linear B, the Mycenaean administrative script, had vanished so completely that no one in Greece had any memory of it. The new alphabet was adapted from the Phoenician trading script, modified by Greek speakers who added vowel signs that Phoenician lacked, creating for the first time in history a writing system that could represent every sound of a spoken language with complete precision. This modification, the addition of vowels, was not a small technical adjustment. It fundamentally changed what writing could do and who could use it. Linear B had been a specialist's tool, requiring years of training and used exclusively by professional palace scribes. The Greek alphabet, with its smaller number of characters and its complete phonetic representation, could be learned by anyone in weeks. It was designed not for palace administration, but for the everyday needs of merchants and farmers and craftsmen who needed to record transactions and agreements. From its first moment, Greek literacy was more democratic than any writing system that had preceded it. The communities that the alphabet was helping to connect and to articulate were themselves in the process of taking the form that would make the Greek world unlike anything that had existed before it. The polis, the city-state, the small, self-governing community that would become the political laboratory of the ancient world, was emerging from the Dark Age villages with a set of assumptions about governance and citizenship that would eventually produce the most consequential political experiment in human history. Every idea that changes the world has a birthplace, and the birthplace is almost never where you would expect it. The idea of democracy, of ordinary people governing themselves, of the community as a whole, having the right to decide how the community is run, did not emerge from the greatest or most powerful city in the ancient world. It did not emerge from a place of surplus comfort or easy stability. It emerged from a city in crisis, from a community pushed to the edge of its own internal contradictions, where the gap between the wealthy and the desperate had become so extreme that the only choice available was between radical reform and violent collapse. Athens in the early 6th century BC was not the golden city of the Parthenon and the philosophers. It was a place where significant numbers of free citizens had been reduced to slavery by debt, where the tension between the aristocratic families who owned the land and the farmers who worked it had been building for generations toward a breaking point, and where the question of who had the right to make decisions for the community had no agreed answer. What came out of that crisis was an answer that the world has been arguing about ever since. Solon arrived at the moment of crisis with a mandate that no one before him had been given and that no reasonable person should have accepted. The Athenians, aristocrats, and commoners alike were so close to violence that both sides agreed to hand the problem to a single man and trust him to find a solution that would hold. Solon was a poet and a merchant, not a general or an aristocrat of the highest rank, and what he did with the power he was given was so unexpected that even the people who benefited from it seem not to have fully believed it was happening. He cancelled the existing debts, all of them, completely, removing the stones that had been set in the fields to mark land pledged as collateral, freeing everyone who had been enslaved for debt, and sending to retrieve from foreign countries the Athenians who had been sold abroad as slaves when they could not pay what they owed. He prohibited debt slavery for the future, making it impossible for a creditor to claim the body of a debtor regardless of what was owed. He created courts in which ordinary citizens could participate as jurors, making the legal system something that was not exclusively managed by and for the aristocratic families who had previously controlled it. And then, when the Athenian elite offered him the position of tyrant, the absolute ruler who would maintain order by force, he refused it. He went into voluntary exile for 10 years specifically to prevent himself from being used as a tool to undo what he had done. He understood that his presence, with the authority he had accumulated, was itself a threat to the reforms he had made. The Athenians, left with his laws and without their author, immediately began disputing what the laws meant, which was, in its own way, a form of democracy beginning to function. The period between Solon's reforms and the next great transformation was not peaceful. Athens went through a generation of factional conflict and eventually experienced the tyranny of Pisistratos and his sons, men who governed Athens without the formal overthrow of Solon's institutions, but whose personal authority represented the kind of concentrated individual power that the reforms had been designed to prevent. Pisistratos was not, by ancient standards, an especially cruel or oppressive tyrant. He maintained Solon's laws. He patronized culture and built public works, but his son Hippias, who ruled after his brother Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BC, became increasingly paranoid and repressive, and when the Spartans helped drive him out in 510 BC, the Athenians found themselves facing the same fundamental question that Solon had tried to answer. What kind of governance were they actually going to have? Cleisthenes gave the answer that has lasted. His reforms of 508 and 507 BC addressed the most fundamental problem in Athenian political life, the power of the great aristocratic families, which rested not on wealth alone, but on the networks of clients and dependents that the traditional tribal organization of Athenian society had built over generations. Cleisthenes broke those networks by reorganizing the Athenian citizen body into new units based not on family connection but on geography, mixing citizens from different parts of Attica into the same political groups so that the inherited loyalties of the old tribal system could not function as they always had. He created an assembly where every male citizen had the right to speak and to vote on the decisions of the community. He created a council of 500, chosen by lot from the citizen body, to prepare business for the assembly. He created a system of courts, in which juries of ordinary citizens made the legal decisions that had previously been controlled by aristocratic magistrates. The machinery of Athenian democracy was not yet complete significant. Further reforms under Ephialtes in 461 BC would strip the remaining power from the Areopagus Council, the last major institutional stronghold of aristocratic authority, and the fully developed Athenian democracy that Pericles presided over represented a generation of further evolution beyond Cleisthenes. But the fundamental principle was established in those 2 years, and the Greeks recognized it. They called Cleisthenes the father of democracy. They coined the word demokratia, the rule of the demos, the ordinary people to name what he had created. The word was not universally celebrated. To the aristocrats of Athens and of the other Greek city-states, democratia carried a taint of instability and vulgarity. The concern that decision-making power in the hands of ordinary people meant decision-making power in the hands of the ignorant, the emotional, and the easily manipulated. Plato would eventually make this critique with philosophical precision that has never been fully answered. But to the Athenian citizens who assembled on the Pnyx Hill to debate and vote on the laws and policies of their community, democratia meant something that no previous political arrangement had given them: the sense that the community's decisions were their decisions, that the laws they lived under were laws they had participated in making, that they were not simply subjects of a power that existed above them, but members of a community that governed itself. The city that had invented the framework for self-governance now had to prove that self-governance could survive the real world, the world of powerful enemies, military threats, and the specific kind of hubris that comes when a community believes it has discovered something so important that the normal rules of caution no longer apply. There is a specific kind of historical moment when the future of civilization genuinely hangs on a single decision, a single battle, a single day. Most of the time, when people say that, they are exaggerating. The Persian Wars are one of the cases where they are not. In 490 BC, when the Persian fleet appeared off the coast of Attica and landed its army at the plain of Marathon, the political experiment that Athens had just begun, the government of ordinary people by ordinary people, the idea that a community could decide its own fate through collective deliberation rather than through the will of a king, had existed for less than 20 years. It had not yet produced the Parthenon, or the tragedies of Sophocles, or the philosophy of Socrates. It had not yet proven that it could survive contact with the most powerful military force on earth. What happened at Marathon, and in the years that followed, would determine whether the Greek experiment in self-governance would continue long enough to change the world. The Persian Empire that sent its forces against Greece in 490 BC was not a distant or abstract threat. It was the dominant power of the known world, a state that stretched from the borders of India in the east to Egypt in the south to the shores of the Aegean in the west, that had absorbed the great civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt and Asia Minor, that administered its enormous territory through a system of provincial governors and royal roads, and an imperial ideology that presented the Persian king as the rightful ruler of all the peoples of the earth. The Greek city-states that had helped the Greek cities of Asia Minor rebel against Persian rule had committed what the Persian king Darius regarded as a straightforward act of insubordination, and the army he sent to punish them was not assembled with the expectation of a serious fight. Greece was small. The city-states were frequently at war with each other. There was no reason to expect that the people who could not stop fighting among themselves for long enough to form a stable alliance would be able to stop a Persian army that had absorbed far larger and more organized opposition without serious difficulty. What happened at Marathon defied every reasonable expectation. The Athenian general Miltiades, a man whose career had taken him through the Persian service before his return to Athens, a man who understood from the inside how the Persian army fought and what its tactical vulnerabilities were, ordered something that went against every instinct of conventional ancient warfare. He attacked at a run. The standard approach for Athens was evacuated and burned. The decision to abandon the city rather than defend it was one of the most psychologically agonizing in the history of the ancient world. The people of Athens leaving their homes, their temples, their graves, watching from the ships and the far shore as the Persians systematically destroyed what they had built. The Athenian commander Themistocles, who had spent years preparing for this confrontation and who had persuaded the Athenians to build the navy that was their only real weapon against Persian power, then executed one of the most brilliant pieces of tactical deception in ancient military history. He lured the Persian navy into the narrow straits between the island of Salamis and the Athenian coast waters, so confined that the Persian fleet's numerical superiority became a disadvantage, that the Persians' larger ships could not maneuver, that the battle became a grinding close-quarters confrontation, rather than the open-water engagement where Persian numbers would have been decisive. The Persian navy was destroyed at Salamis. Without the ability to supply and support his enormous land army by sea, Xerxes had no choice but to withdraw with a portion of his forces. The army he left behind under Mardonius was defeated the following year at Plataea, in a battle that involved the largest Greek coalition ever assembled, and that ended the Persian military presence in mainland Greece permanently. The Greece that emerged from the Persian Wars was profoundly changed by having survived them. The city that had done the most to save Greece, that had provided the fleet at Salamis, that had evacuated its people and watched its city burn rather than submit, was Athens. And Athens was about to collect on that contribution in ways that would produce the most extraordinary cultural flowering in the ancient world, and also the most devastating war. There are moments in history when a specific place and a specific time produce something so far beyond what came before them that the only honest response is to stop and try to understand how it happened. The Athens of the 5th century BC is one of those moments, arguably the most concentrated burst of human creative achievement in the ancient world, a city that within the span of a single lifetime produced works of art, architecture, drama, philosophy, and historical writing that 2,500 years of subsequent civilization have not been able to surpass. The Parthenon still stands, damaged and stripped of most of what made it magnificent, and it is still one of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed by human hands. The tragedies of Sophocles are still performed in theatres around the world, and still produce the specific experience of recognition and grief that the Greeks called catharsis. The philosophical questions that Socrates walked through the Athenian marketplace, asking strangers to think about, are still the questions that every serious person eventually has to confront. Something happened in Athens in the 5th century BC that was not repeated anywhere else at any other time, and the question of why deserves more than a passing answer. Pericles stands at the center of the Golden Age, not because he created it. No single person creates a civilization's greatest moment, but because he was its most complete political expression, the person whose vision of what Athens was and what it should be shaped the decisions that defined the era. He was not a king, and not a tyrant. He was a general, elected to that position by the Athenian assembly year after year for roughly 3 decades, retaining the trust of the people through the quality of his thinking and the power of his speaking, rather than through inherited authority or the threat of force. He presided over a democracy, while being himself an aristocrat who appears to have had genuine contempt for some of the democracy's messier tendencies, the susceptibility to demagogues, the willingness of the assembly to make decisions on the basis of emotion rather than reason. He managed this contradiction by making himself the person the assembly most wanted to listen to, by consistently providing the best available analysis of the situation Athens faced and the most persuasive case for the policy he believed was correct. When he was wrong, as he was about the Peloponnesian War's manageability, the consequences were catastrophic. But the period of his dominance, before the war consumed what he had built, was the period that made Athens what history has remembered. The Parthenon was Pericles' most deliberate statement, and it requires a moment of genuine attention because the building we see today, pale, stripped, partly ruined, is so different from what it was when it was completed in 432 BC that the comparison almost requires an act of imagination. The Parthenon was painted. Its sculptures were painted in vivid colors, and the marble of its columns and friezes was enhanced with pigments and with bronze and gold attachments that caught the Mediterranean light in ways that the worn white stone cannot replicate. The great statue of Athena that stood inside it 40 feet high, constructed of gold and ivory over a wooden frame, one of the most celebrated works of art in the ancient world, is entirely gone. The building was a statement of the most aggressive kind. It said that Athens was the center of the civilized world, that the democracy had produced something worthy of the goddess who protected the city, and that the money which the allied cities of the Delian League had contributed to the defense of Greece against Persia was being used to make Athens beautiful. The allied cities had not been consulted about this reallocation of their tribute. Pericles' argument was that as long as Athens was providing the naval protection it had promised, the League's money was Athens to spend as it chose. It was a position that made logical sense, and was also straightforwardly imperial, and it illustrated the fundamental tension at the heart of Periclean Athens, a democracy at home that was an empire abroad. The intellectual and cultural achievement that surrounded the Parthenon was not decorative. It was functional, in the specific sense that it grew from and fed back into the democratic political culture that made Athens what it was. The great tragedies that Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides produced for the Athenian festivals were not private entertainments for wealthy audiences. They were civic events attended by the entire citizen body, funded by the city and by wealthy citizens competing for the honor of sponsoring a production, performed in outdoor theaters that could hold audiences of 15,000 or more. The plays engaged directly with questions that were alive in Athenian democratic life: the limits of human knowledge, the relationship between divine will and human agency, the costs of pride in those who held power, the obligations of leaders to the communities they governed. When Aeschylus put the trial of Orestes on the stage and showed the Athenian law court as the institution that resolved the most ancient and most blood-soaked of human conflicts, he was not writing escapism. He was arguing that the democratic institutions of Athens represented a genuine achievement of human civilization over the blood cycle of tribal revenge. Socrates was the strangest and most important product of the Golden Age, a man who wrote nothing, built nothing, and won no battles, but who changed the direction of human thought more permanently than almost anyone who lived before him. He walked through the Athenian marketplace, the agora, and asked questions. He asked craftsmen whether they really understood the principles behind their craft, and they discovered they did not. He asked politicians whether they really understood the nature of justice, and they discovered they did not. He asked philosophers whether they really understood the things they claimed to know, and they discovered they did not. His method, persistent, logical questioning that pushed every claim toward its foundations and refused to accept comfortable approximations as answers, was itself a product of the democratic public space, of a culture that had decided arguments should be settled by the quality of reasoning rather than by the authority of the person making them. It was also, eventually, the thing that got him killed. The democracy that had produced all of this was about to be tested in a way it had not been tested by the Persians, not by an external enemy that unified the city in resistance, but by a war against another Greek city that divided it, exhausted it, and ultimately revealed the specific ways in which the most brilliant political experiment in the ancient world contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction. Thucydides, who was an Athenian general before he became a historian, wrote something about the origins of the Peloponnesian War that has been quoted by students of international relations ever since, because it describes something that appears to be permanently true about how powerful states relate to each other. He wrote that the growth of Athenian power and the fear that growth inspired in Sparta made the war inevitable. He did not mean that specific individuals were irrelevant or that specific decisions did not matter. He meant that there is a pattern that repeats itself across time and across cultures, in which a rising power and an established power find themselves in a space where the rising power's continued growth feels, to the established power, like a threat that eventually becomes unacceptable. The specific triggers of the Peloponnesian War were the conflicts between Athens and Sparta's most important ally, Corinth, over influence in the Western Greek world. The real cause was that Athens had spent the decades since the Persian Wars becoming something that Sparta had not anticipated and could not easily coexist with. The dominant power of the Greek world, building an empire while calling it an alliance, growing richer and stronger and more confident, while Sparta watched from its position of land-based military supremacy and calculated that the balance was shifting in ways that would eventually leave Sparta with no good options. The war that began in 431 BC was not an accident. It was the collision of two incompatible visions of how the Greek world should be organized, produced by the specific structural tension of two powers whose strengths were too different for either to simply dominate the other. Athens had a navy. Sparta had an army. These were not merely military facts, they were the entire strategic logic of the war, and they explain why a conflict that both sides expected to resolve quickly lasted 27 years. The Spartan strategy was to invade Attica, the agricultural territory around Athens, devastate the crops and farms and country houses that the Athenian population depended on, and force the Athenians out from behind their walls to fight a land battle on terms that Spartan hoplites would win with certainty. Pericles understood this and refused to cooperate with it. His strategy was to accept the pain of the Spartan invasions, to bring the rural population of Attica inside the walls of Athens and let the Spartans ravage the countryside they had abandoned while using Athenian naval power. To raid the coasts of the Peloponnese and demonstrate that Sparta's land power could not protect its own coastline against a fleet it could not match. Neither strategy could produce a decisive result. The Spartans could devastate Attica, but could not take Athens behind its walls and its long walls connecting the city to its port. The Athenians could raid Peloponnesian coastlines, but could not destroy Spartan land power or break the Spartan alliance. The war ground forward without resolution, while the human cost accumulated on both sides. And then the plague arrived. In the summer of 430 BC, a disease modern genetic analysis of skeletal remains from Athenian burial sites suggests it may have been typhoid fever, though the identification remains contested, appeared in the port of Athens, carried by ships from somewhere to the east, and spread with horrifying speed through a population that had been compressed behind the city walls to avoid the Spartan invasion. The population density inside Athens was, by this point, extreme people sleeping in the streets, crowded into temples, packed into spaces that the city had never been designed to hold in peacetime, let alone in epidemic conditions. Thucydides himself caught the disease and survived, and his account of what it did to the city is one of the most devastating pieces of historical writing in the ancient record. The physical symptoms described with clinical precision. The social breakdown that followed, as the normal rules of behavior collapsed under the weight of mass death, the abandonment of burial practices, the sense that no one knew what they had done to deserve this, and therefore the conventional relationship between piety and divine protection had been severed. Perhaps a quarter of the Athenian population died. Pericles, who had designed the strategy, who had persuaded the assembly to accept its painful logic year after year, who was the one person whose authority and credibility might have maintained the discipline the strategy required, died in 429 BC. He was the last casualty the Athenians could not afford. What followed the death of Pericles was the slow unraveling of everything his strategy depended on. Without him, the Athenian assembly became what its critics had always warned it could become under less capable leadership, a body susceptible to the arguments of whoever spoke most compellingly in the moment, regardless of whether those arguments would look wise in the months and years that followed. The demagogues who replaced Pericles in influence Cleon most prominently understood how to move the assembly, but not how to restrain it, and the result was a series of decisions that combined tactical hardness with strategic incoherence. The massacre of the entire male population of Mytilene voted in fury one day and partially reversed the next when the assembly repented, illustrated the specific danger of democratic decision-making under emotional pressure. But the worst decision came in 415 BC, when the Athenian assembly voted to send a massive expeditionary force to conquer Sicily, the large island whose wealth and resources could, in theory, give Athens the power to win the war decisively. The cautious general Nicias argued against it. The brilliant and deeply unreliable Alcibiades argued for it. The assembly, swayed by Alcibiades' charisma and the dream of empire, voted to go. The force assembled was the largest Athens had ever sent, beyond its own waters, ships, soldiers, money, everything the city could spare, and it was destroyed. Not damaged, not defeated in a battle that could be recovered from. Destroyed. The Athenian fleet was trapped in the harbour of Syracuse. The soldiers who tried to escape were hunted down across the Sicilian countryside, and those who survived the retreat were imprisoned in the stone quarries of Syracuse, where they died slowly of exposure and disease and despair. The war continued for 9 more years after the Sicilian disaster, which is itself a testimony to the depth of Athenian resilience, but the terms had changed irrevocably. Sparta, recognizing that the war could not be won without a navy that could match Athens at sea, accepted financial support from Persia, the empire that both Athens and Sparta had fought together to repel 40 years earlier, and used Persian money to build a fleet. The irony was sharp enough that both sides felt it, and neither could afford to let it change their calculations. The final act came at Aegospotami, in 230 Pench BC, where the Athenian fleet was caught by a Spartan admiral, while its crews were ashore, and was destroyed almost without a fight. The most complete naval defeat in Athenian history, achieved not through tactical genius, but through the specific vulnerability of a democratic system that could not maintain the discipline that sustained military operations required. Athens, starving behind a blockade, surrendered in 404 BC. Its walls were torn down to the music of flutes. The Golden Age was over. The Greece that emerged from the Peloponnesian War was not the Greece that had entered it. A generation of men was dead. The treasury that had built the Parthenon was empty. The confidence that had survived the Persian invasion was broken in a way that no external enemy had managed to break it. And into the space left by that breaking, a power from the north was watching and calculating and preparing for its moment. The Greeks were so busy fighting each other after the Peloponnesian War that they did not notice the kingdom to their north until it was too late to stop what was coming. This is not entirely a failure of intelligence or imagination. The post-war decades genuinely offered a great deal to keep the Greek city-states occupied with each other. Sparta, having won the war, proved to be as incapable of stable hegemony as Athens had been, and its attempt to maintain dominance through military force, rather than through the alliance networks that had given it influence, generated resentment that eventually produced the military coalition that defeated a Spartan force at the Pusts. Battle of Leuctra, in 371 BC. Thebes, under its extraordinary general Epaminondas, then briefly occupied the dominant position, innovating in military tactics as significantly as anyone since the Persian Wars, and for a moment appearing to be the city that would finally unite Greece under stable leadership. But Epaminondas died at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BC, and with him died Thebes' brief moment of supremacy, because his dominance had been so personal that the city could not sustain it without him. The Greek world returned to its default condition of approximately equal powers fighting approximately inconclusive wars, and the accumulation of exhaustion and cynicism and damage to the social fabric of the city-states was not something that any of the competing powers seemed to notice or to find alarming. They were looking at each other. They were not looking north. Philip II came to the Macedonian throne in 359 BC in the specific circumstances of a kingdom that was genuinely in danger of ceasing to exist. Macedonia was surrounded by threats: Illyrians to the west, Paeonians to the north, and to the south, the Greek city-states that had never regarded Macedonia as quite equal to themselves, a semi-Greek kingdom with Greek pretensions that the city-states generally found amusing rather than threatening. What Philip did with these circumstances, in the 20 years between his accession and the battle that ended Greek independence, was one of the most remarkable personal achievements in ancient history. Not the achievement of a conqueror who simply applied superior force, but the achievement of a transformer who took something weak and made it into something that the existing powers could not match because they did not understand what they were looking at until the understanding came too late. The military transformation was the most visible part. Philip took the Macedonian infantry tradition and redesigned it around a weapon called the sarissa, a pike approximately 6 meters long, so long that it required both hands to use, so long that when a formation of sarissa-equipped infantry locked their weapons forward, the front of the formation presented a wall of overlapping spear points that hoplite weapons simply could not reach through. The Macedonian phalanx could pin an enemy force and prevent it from maneuvering, while Philip's cavalry, the companion cavalry, an elite force of noble horsemen fighting in a disciplined wedge formation that was also his innovation, struck the flanks or the rear at the decisive moment. The combination was tactically more sophisticated than anything the Greek city-states were using, and it was made possible by something the city-states' citizen militias could not replicate: a professional army that trained year-round, campaigned year-round, and built the kind of collective tactical precision that comes only from repetition and from the specific trust that develops between soldiers who have trained and fought together over years. The Greek hoplite was a citizen who fought in the summer and farmed in the winter. The Macedonian soldier was a professional whose entire identity was built around his army because Philip paid him and equipped him and gave him a share of the winnings in a way that the city-state militia system never did. The military innovations mattered. What made them decisive was Philip's diplomatic intelligence, which was applied with a subtlety that the Greek city-states consistently underestimated because they assumed a Macedonian king must be less sophisticated than themselves. Philip offered alliances to cities that were willing to accommodate Macedonian interests, creating relationships that divided the Greek world and prevented the formation of the unified coalition that might have stopped him. He presented himself, when the audience was receptive, as a champion of Pan-Hellenism, the idea that Greeks should unite under a common cause against their common Persian enemy, exploiting the rhetorical tradition of Greek unity that the Persian Wars had established while systematically undermining the political independence that made genuine Greek unity impossible. He settled disputes between Greek cities as an arbitrator, acquiring the appearance of benevolence while extending Macedonian influence into the arbitrated settlements. He was simultaneously the most dangerous threat to Greek independence and the most plausible candidate for the kind of Greek leadership that Greek intellectuals had been arguing for since Pericles. Demosthenes saw it. The greatest orator Athens produced spent years delivering the speeches that gave the English language its word for denunciatory political argument, the Philippics, warning the Athenian assembly with a precision and a passion that the historical record has preserved in full, that Philip was not a friend of Greece, but the methodical destroyer of Greek freedom, moving city by city, alliance by alliance, toward the moment when no coalition could be assembled that could stop him. The assembly listened, debated, and mostly did not act in time or in sufficient force. The decisive confrontation came at Chaeronea in Boeotia in 338 BC, where the combined forces of Athens and Thebes met Philip's army, and Philip's 18-year-old son Alexander led the invasion of Persia in 334 BC began with a gesture that tells you something important about how Alexander understood himself and his campaign. When his fleet crossed the Hellespont into Asia Minor, Alexander threw his spear into the Asian soil from the ship before he disembarked, claiming the continent as his, won by the spear, in the language of Homeric heroism that he had been marinating in since childhood. He was not simply planning a military campaign. He was enacting an epic, casting himself in the role of Achilles, and finding his Troy in the Persian Empire that had burned Athens a century and a half before he was born. He visited the site of Troy before his first battle. He ran naked around Achilles' tomb. These were not the actions of a purely rational military strategist. They were the actions of a man for whom the boundary between the heroic past and his own present had become genuinely permeable, and who measured himself against standards that most people experienced only as literary fiction. The military genius was entirely real, and it operated on a level that left his opponents consistently unable to adapt before it was too late. At the Granicus River in 334 BC, against a Persian provincial force that had positioned itself defensively on the far bank, Alexander led the cavalry charge across the river himself, against the advice of his generals, and broke the Persian line before it could organize a coherent response. The personal courage was not recklessness, it was a calculated element of his tactical approach, because an army that watches its commander lead the charge is an army with a specific kind of motivation that no amount of discipline can fully replicate. At Issus in 333 BC, where he met the Persian king Darius III in person for the first time, the battle became the visual centerpiece of the ancient world's understanding of the confrontation between Greece and Persia. The famous mosaic shows Alexander driving his horse directly toward Darius, with the absolute physical concentration of someone who has reduced the entire war to a single point, while Darius turns to flee with an expression that captures the specific horror of a god-king discovering that his divine protection has limits. Darius escaped. His family did not. His mother, his wife, and his daughters were captured by Alexander, who treated them with a courtesy and a respect that the ancient sources describe with what seems like genuine surprise, as if the expectation of a conqueror's brutality toward a defeated king's women was so complete that its absence required special mention. The march to Egypt, to Gaugamela, to Persepolis, and then east, through the increasingly difficult terrain of what is now Afghanistan and Pakistan, followed its own internal logic, a logic that Alexander understood perfectly, and that his men found increasingly difficult to accept, as the years accumulated and the distance from home grew past any point that ordinary human geography could accommodate. At Gaugamela in 331 BC, Darius had chosen his ground carefully, a wide plain where his numerical advantage and his scythed chariots could be fully deployed. Alexander's response was a piece of tactical theatre that combined genuine genius with the specific kind of personal risk that no general who valued his own life above the outcome could have taken. He identified the gap between two sections of the Persian line, drove his cavalry wedge into it personally at full speed, and shattered the Persian center before Darius could redirect his forces to close the breach. Darius fled again. He was killed shortly afterward by his own officials, who apparently calculated that offering Alexander a dead rival was preferable to facing him with a living one. It was not a good calculation. Alexander was furious, gave Darius a royal funeral, and pressed east with an army that was now fighting not to defeat Persia but to absorb it. The mutiny at the Hyphasis River in 326 BC was the one defeat of Alexander's career, and it was inflicted not by an enemy army, but by the accumulated exhaustion of men who had followed him for 10 years across 20,000 kilometers, and who could not see, in any direction, the shape of an ending. They had crossed deserts and mountains and rivers larger than anything in Greece. They had fought armies of war, elephants. They had buried more companions than they could count. And Alexander, standing at the edge of what he believed was the final river before the end of the world, was asking them to cross one more. They refused. He raged. He shut himself in his tent for 3 days, refusing to eat, waiting for them to change their minds. They did not. For the first time in his life, Alexander accepted a decision he had not made. He turned back. The return march was brutal through the Gadrosian Desert in what is now southern Pakistan, a route that historians believe Alexander chose partly as punishment for the mutiny, where thousands of soldiers, camp followers, and civilians died of heat and thirst, in conditions that the army's previous sufferings had not prepared them for. He reached Babylon in 323 BC and began planning his next campaign, the conquest of Arabia, when the fever took him. He had been drinking heavily for years, and the drinking had damaged him in ways that made him vulnerable to the infection that killed him. He died over 11 days, declining slowly enough that his soldiers filed past his bed in silent thousands to see him before he was gone, and he recognized them but could apparently no longer speak. He was 32 years old. The empire he had built had no institutional structure capable of surviving his absence. It depended entirely on his personal authority, his military genius, and his ability to hold together commanders who respected him absolutely and each other barely at all. Within 2 years of his death, the wars of succession had begun. Within a generation, the empire was divided into the kingdoms of his generals, each of them ruling a piece of what Alexander had built, and none of them capable of holding the whole. What Alexander's conquests left behind was not a political structure, but a cultural one, the spread of the Greek language, Greek ideas, and Greek ways of organizing knowledge across a world that stretched from Egypt to the borders of India. The civilization that emerged from this spreading was called Hellenistic, and it produced some of the most important scientific and philosophical work in the ancient world, in the specific institutional form that one of Alexander's successors built to house it. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BC without a capable heir, his empire did not collapse immediately. It exploded. The generals who had built their careers in his service, men who had known each other for decades, who had fought beside each other across 20,000 kilometers of campaign, who had developed the particular mixture of admiration and competitive resentment that accumulates between extraordinary people forced into close proximity for too long, turned on each other with an energy that would have been impressive if it had been directed at anything other than their mutual destruction. The wars of the Diadochi, the successors, lasted for roughly 40 years and produced a body count that the ancient sources record in numbers that are almost certainly exaggerated and are nonetheless staggering. What emerged from the wreckage was not Alexander's empire that was gone, too dependent on his personal authority to survive his death by more than a few years, but 3 major kingdoms that divided the conquered world between them and proceeded to govern it in ways that had no precedent in the Greek tradition. The Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt, the Seleucid kingdom in Asia, and the Antigonid kingdom in Macedonia and Greece were not city-states. They were not governed by assemblies of citizens making collective decisions. They were territorial monarchies on a scale that the Greek world had never previously produced, run by Greek-speaking ruling classes who administered populations of entirely different cultures in the specific combination of Greek institutional forms and local traditions that the word Hellenistic was coined to describe. Something genuinely new was operating in the world, and its most important site was a city that Alexander had founded on the Egyptian coast, and that would become, within a generation of his death, the intellectual capital of the ancient world. Alexandria was planned from the beginning to be something different from any city that had existed before it. Alexander had chosen the site himself on his march to Egypt in 331 BC, a strip of land between the Mediterranean and Lake Mareotis, with a natural harbour that was among the best in the eastern Mediterranean, protected from the silting that made other Egyptian harbour sites problematic, positioned to become the trading hub between the Mediterranean world and the wealth of Egypt's interior. The city that his successors built there became, under the Ptolemaic kings who ruled Egypt after Alexander's death, an experiment in concentrated intellectual patronage on a scale that no previous government had attempted. The Ptolemies were not, primarily, philosophers or scientists. They were kings with dynastic ambitions and a clear understanding that the prestige of being the patrons of the greatest intellectual institution in the world was worth the considerable financial investment it required. They built the museum, a word that meant literally the house of the muses, the goddesses of learning and art, and that functioned as what we would now call a research institution, providing its scholars with stipends, meals, lodging, and freedom from the normal obligations of earning a living so that they could dedicate themselves entirely to the advancement of knowledge. And, attached to the museum, they built the library, the greatest collection of written knowledge that the ancient world had ever seen. At its height, containing somewhere between 40,000 and 700,000 scrolls, organized and catalogued by scholars who were also contributing to the collection by producing new works to be added to it. The achievements of the Alexandrian scholars are worth pausing on, because they demonstrate something important about what concentrated intellectual patronage can produce when the institutional conditions are right. Euclid arrived in Alexandria around 300 BC, and wrote the Elements, a systematic treatment of geometry that organized the field's accumulated knowledge into a logical sequence of definitions, axioms, and proofs that was so perfectly constructed that it served as the primary textbook for the subject for 2,000 years, until the development of non-Euclidean geometry in the 19th century. Eratosthenes, who served as the chief librarian of the library, calculated the circumference of the Earth by comparing the angle at which the sun's rays struck the surface in Alexandria and in the city of Syene in southern Egypt, two cities whose distance apart he knew and arrived at, a figure that was within a few % of the value that modern measurement has established. He was working in the 3rd century BC, with no instruments beyond careful observation and the mathematical tools that his training provided, and he was approximately right about the size of the planet. Aristarchus of Samos proposed, in the same period, that the Earth moved around the Sun rather than the Sun around the Earth, a heliocentric model of the solar system that was not revived in mainstream Western science until Copernicus published his heliocentric theory in Iten Ubai Sishasan. Aristarchus was largely rejected by his contemporaries, whose common sense told them that the Earth did not move, and whose philosophical frameworks provided reasons to prefer the geocentric model. He had the correct answer 18 centuries before anyone was ready to believe it. The political history of the Hellenistic world was considerably less distinguished than its scientific achievements, and the contrast between the two is one of the defining characteristics of the era. The successor kingdoms spent the Hellenistic period in a near-continuous state of warfare, with each other wars over territory, over succession, over the control of strategic cities and trade routes, wars that were sometimes interrupted by truces, but never by anything that could be described as a genuine settlement. The Greek city-states of the mainland, nominally under Macedonian authority but never fully reconciled to it, continued their characteristic behavior of forming alliances, fighting wars, and dissolving alliances with a persistence that was remarkable, given how consistently it failed to produce useful results. The Achaean League in the Peloponnese and the Aetolian League in central Greece both represented genuine attempts to create intercity political structures that could exercise real power, and both achieved periods of genuine effectiveness, but neither was able to create the sustained unity that the situation increasingly required. The Greek world, occupied with its internal conflicts and its resistance to Macedonian authority, failed to register in time the significance of what was happening in the Western Mediterranean, the growth of a city on the Tiber River from a local Italian power into something that was absorbing the entire Western Mediterranean world, with a methodical efficiency that the fragmented Greek East was structurally incapable of matching. The Romans came into the Greek world not as obvious conquerors, but as arbitrators, as patrons, as friends of Greek culture, and declared champions of Greek freedom. By the time the Greeks fully understood what Roman friendship actually meant, the moment when that understanding might have changed anything had already passed. The most dangerous conquerors in history are not always the ones who arrive with obvious hostility. Sometimes the most dangerous are the ones who arrive as friends who offer help, who claim to share your values, who declare themselves the champions of your freedom, while the mechanisms of their control are being quietly installed around you. Rome's relationship with Greece in the 2nd century BC followed this pattern with a consistency that suggests either deliberate strategy or the specific kind of institutional momentum that produces the same results as deliberate strategy, without requiring anyone to explicitly plan them. The Romans who first intervened in Greek affairs in the early 2nd century BC were, many of them, genuinely admirers of Greek culture. The Greek language was the language of educated Romans. Greek philosophy, Greek art, and Greek literature were the models against which Roman cultural achievement measured itself. When Roman generals declared their commitment to Greek freedom, some of them appear to have meant it in the way that people mean things when the meaning is convenient, and the cost of honoring it has not yet arrived. The cost arrived on schedule. Rome's entry into Greek affairs was made possible by a mistake that Philip V of Macedonia committed during the darkest moment of Roman history. When Hannibal crossed the Alps in 218 BC and proceeded to inflict on Rome a series of military defeats that brought the survival of the Roman state into genuine question, when Hannibal's army was sitting in Italy, devastating the countryside, and apparently demonstrating that Rome's military power was not as formidable as its neighbors had assumed. Philip V chose that moment to form an alliance with Carthage. From Philip's perspective, this was reasonable calculation. Carthage appeared to be winning, Rome appeared to be in serious trouble, and an alliance with the winning side seemed like the kind of decision that kings were supposed to make. What it was, in its consequences, was the decision that gave Rome a permanent justification for intervention in Greek affairs, because when Rome eventually defeated Carthage against all apparent probability at the moment of the alliance, it remembered who had sided with its enemy when the outcome was in doubt. The First and Second Macedonian Wars were Rome, settling that account with a methodical patience that the Greek world had not seen coming and had not prepared for. The Battle of Cynoscephalae in 197 BC was the military demonstration that changed everything the Greek world believed about its own defences. The Macedonian phalanx, the sarissa-equipped infantry formation that Philip II had invented and Alexander had used to conquer the known world, had been the most effective military formation in the ancient world for over a post-century. It had defeated everything the Greek city-states could put against it. What it had not faced was the Roman legion, and what Cynoscephalae demonstrated was that the phalanx, for all its ferocious frontal power, had specific vulnerabilities in broken terrain, where it could not maintain the tight formation that made it effective. The Roman manipular system, smaller, more flexible tactical units that could operate independently and respond to changing conditions, found the gaps in the phalanx formation and exploited them with a methodical efficiency that the Macedonian commanders had no tactical answer for. The Macedonian military advantage, which had been the foundation of Macedonian political power in the Greek world for nearly 2 centuries, was broken in a single afternoon on a ridge in Thessaly. The Roman general Flamininus, who commanded at Cynoscephalae and who appears to have been one of the Romans who genuinely loved Greek culture, staged the declaration of Greek freedom at the Isthmian Games of 196 BC in a manner calculated to produce maximum dramatic impact. A herald announced that Rome declared the Greek cities free, ungarrisoned, ungoverned by foreign authority, and subject to their own traditional laws. The crowd's response was so extreme, so far beyond any public reaction that the Games had previously produced, that Plutarch's account describes birds falling stunned from the sky, unable to keep flight in the noise of the cheering. The story is almost certainly embellishment. The emotion behind it was real. The Greek world had spent 2 generations under Macedonian authority, and before that centuries of intercity warfare that had ground down its capacity for genuine self-governance. The promise of freedom from Rome carried a weight that no amount of subsequent cynicism can entirely erase. The Greeks cheered because they genuinely wanted to believe what they were being told. The Romans were genuinely moved by the cheering, because the admiration of the people whose civilization they admired was itself a form of the approval they were seeking. For a brief moment, the relationship was exactly what both sides claimed it was. Then the moment ended, and the relationship became what it actually was. The freedom lasted, in practice, as long as the Greek cities agreed with Rome about what freedom meant and made the decisions that Rome considered appropriate for free Greek cities to make. When they disagreed, when the Achaean League began to assert its independence in ways that Roman senators found presumptuous, when protests about Roman interference in the League's internal affairs escalated into the confrontation that Rome eventually chose to treat as a military matter, the response was the destruction of Corinth in 146 BC. Corinth was one of the great cities of the Greek world, commercially dominant, architecturally magnificent, strategically positioned at the crossroads of the Greek mainland and the Peloponnese. The Roman consul Mummius killed the men, sold the women and children into slavery, burned the buildings, and shipped the art treasures back to Rome in what the ancient sources agree was a systematic and deliberate act of erasure rather than a military necessity. The Corinthians who died in the destruction had not threatened Rome's survival. They had annoyed the Roman Senate. The distinction between those two things had become, by 146 BC, irrelevant. The destruction of Corinth was a communication addressed not to Corinth. Corinth was gone, but to every other city in the Greek world, about what the limits of Roman tolerance were and what happened to communities that exceeded them. Greek cultural life did not end in 146 BC. The philosophers continued to philosophize, the historians continued to write. The language continued to function as the language of educated people across the Eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The Greek intellectual tradition, absorbed into the Roman world as both a source of prestige and a genuine foundation for Roman culture, produced some of its most enduring figures under Roman authority. But the experiment that the Greek city-states had conducted for nearly 400 years, the experiment of communities governing themselves, of ordinary citizens making the decisions that determined how their communities lived, was finished. The last chapter of Greek political independence had been written in the rubble of Corinth. What survived the end of Greek political freedom was something more enduring than any political structure. The ideas, the language, the questions, the methods of inquiry that the Greek world had produced in its centuries of turbulent self-governance, these did not belong to any empire. They belonged to everyone who encountered them. And what they produced in the centuries that followed the Greek political ending is the world we still live in. 2,500 years is long enough for an empire to rise, dominate the world, and collapse into ruins that future civilizations build their cities on top of. It is long enough for languages to be born, flourish, and die, leaving traces in the words of languages that replaced them. It is long enough for the specific political and cultural circumstances that produced a civilization to become so remote from the present that the civilization itself becomes myth, something that happened once, in a golden time, and cannot be recovered or fully understood. Greece has not followed this pattern. The ideas that the Greek world produced in its centuries of turbulent, the Greek intellectual tradition also survived the collapse of the Roman Empire by a route that Western history has often underestimated. When the Western Roman Empire fragmented in the 5th century AD, and when the libraries and scholarly institutions of Western Europe went into the relative decline that characterized the early medieval period, the Greek texts, the philosophical works, the scientific treatises, the mathematical works of the Alexandrian scholars were preserved, translated, commented on, and extended by scholars working in the Arabic-speaking world. The Islamic Golden Age, which flourished between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries, produced scholarly achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that were built explicitly on the foundation of Greek work. Arab and Persian scholars did not simply preserve Aristotle and Euclid and Galen. They corrected them, extended them, and in some fields surpassed them. When European scholars of the 12th and 13th centuries began seeking access to the Greek philosophical tradition that their own institutions had partially lost, they received it through Arabic translations and Arabic commentaries. The Aristotle that Thomas Aquinas used to construct the philosophical framework of medieval Catholic theology was an Aristotle who had traveled through centuries of Islamic scholarship before he arrived. The recovery of Greek learning that scholars call the Renaissance was, in significant part, a recovery of something that had been kept alive in a different culture while Europe was otherwise occupied. The political legacy is where the Greek influence is most immediately visible and most immediately controversial, because the political questions the Greeks raised about who has the right to govern, about what democracy actually is, about whether ordinary people are capable of making good collective decisions, are not settled questions. They are the questions at the center of every political argument in every democracy in the modern world. American democracy was not simply a copy of Athenian democracy. The American founders were also drawing on Roman republicanism, on English common law, on Enlightenment, natural rights theory, on their own colonial experience of self-governance. But when they wanted to argue for democratic self-governance, they went to Athens for their examples and their vocabulary, because Athens was where the vocabulary had been invented. The word democracy is Greek. The concept of citizenship is Greek. The practice of public deliberation about public decisions of citizens assembling to argue about what the community should do is Greek in a sense that no other civilization can claim with equal force. And the critique of democracy, the systematic, philosophically rigorous argument that rule by ordinary people produces bad outcomes because ordinary people are susceptible to passion, to manipulation, to the specific kind of collective irrationality that Thucydides documented in the Athenian assembly and Plato theorized in the Republic, is also Greek. The argument between democratic faith and democratic skepticism that defines so much of contemporary political life is an argument that was fully articulated in Athens in the 5th and 4th centuries BC and has not been resolved since. What the Greek story ultimately demonstrates is something that does not resolve neatly into either celebration or condemnation. The civilization that produced democracy also produced slavery on a massive scale. The Athenian economy depended on enslaved labor, and the freedom of Athenian citizens was partly made possible by the unfreedom of a population that was roughly as large as the citizen body. The civilization that produced the most sophisticated analysis of justice in the ancient world was also a civilization that practiced imperial domination over its allied cities, that massacred the populations of communities that resisted its authority, and that conducted the Peloponnesian War with a cruelty that its own historians documented without flinching. The civilization that invented the tools of rational inquiry and used them to make advances in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine was also a civilization that never questioned the foundational injustice of slavery in any way that produced political change. The Greeks were not the heroes of their own story. They were human beings in their full complexity, capable of extraordinary insight and extraordinary blindness, of building things of permanent value and destroying things that could never be rebuilt. The question that the full Greek story poses to anyone who takes it seriously is not whether Greece was great. It clearly was. The question is what it means that the greatest concentration of intellectual and cultural achievement in the ancient world was produced in a context of constant war, constant injustice, and ultimately, complete political failure. Whether the achievement was worth the cost. Whether a civilization that could not sustain itself for more than a few generations of genuine flourishing that consumed its golden age in a war of its own choosing, that could not prevent the eventual absorption of its political independence into a larger empire. Whether that civilization should be held up as a model or understood as a warning. The answer, almost certainly, is both simultaneously, which is the most uncomfortable kind of historical truth and also the most honest one. What do you think? A civilization that invented democracy, philosophy, and the foundations of modern science was conquered, absorbed, and erased as a political entity, but its ideas outlived every empire that defeated it. Does that mean ideas are more powerful than armies? Or does it mean that the greatest ideas in human history were not powerful enough to save the people who created them? Could a civilization so brilliant at understanding the world be so poor at governing itself? And if so, could the same thing be true today? Leave your thoughts below. Because the story of ancient Greece is not a story that ended in 146 BC. It is a story that is still happening in every democracy, every courtroom, every university, and every political debate about who gets to decide what the community becomes.